The easiest way to steal a future is to convince everyone the person holding it is invisible. The ballroom shimmered beneath 3 crystal chandeliers, their light spilling across polished marble floors like liquid gold. Waiters in black jackets drifted between tables carrying trays of champagne, while executives laughed beneath the soft notes of a jazz quartet near the stage. At the far end of the room, a giant screen displayed the silver logo of Bennett Global Holdings, one of the most respected companies in the state. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration. In less than an hour, CEO Richard Bennett would announce his successor. Everyone in the room expected the same name: Ethan Crawford. Claire Whitmore pushed a cleaning cart quietly along the wall, guiding a microfiber mop across a faint streak left by a spilled drink. Nobody looked at her twice. To the guests, she was simply part of the furniture. A woman in a gray uniform, a divorced cleaner. Easy to overlook, easy to dismiss. The conversations around her floated through the air. Ethan's practically running the company already. Richard's finally stepping down. It's about time. Claire lowered her eyes and continued working. The wheels of her cart rolled softly over the marble. Then a familiar voice cut through the room. Claire. She stopped. Several heads turned. Ethan Crawford stood near the center of the ballroom wearing a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. His smile looked warm from a distance. Up close, it felt sharp. Come over here, he said. A few executives exchanged amused glances. Claire guided the cart toward him. Every wheel rotation seemed louder than the music. Ethan slipped one hand into his pocket. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced casually, I'd like you to meet someone important from my past. More people turned. Conversations faded. Claire could feel dozens of eyes settling on her uniform. Ethan smiled wider. My ex-wife. Laughter scattered through the crowd. Not cruel enough to sound shocking. Just comfortable enough to sting. Someone lifted an eyebrow. Another guest hid a grin behind a champagne glass. Claire stood still. The ballroom lights reflected off the polished floor beneath her shoes. Ethan looked pleased with himself. Life takes people in different directions, he continued. Some of us end up leading billion-dollar companies. He glanced at Claire's cart. And some of us keep things clean. More laughter. A few guests looked away awkwardly. Claire simply nodded once. No anger. No protest. No speech. She reached down to straighten a cleaning towel hanging from the side of her cart. That was when she noticed it. A black USB drive resting near one of the table legs. Small. Easy to miss. Her eyes lifted briefly. Ethan had shifted his leather portfolio onto a chair only a few feet away. One of its compartments hung slightly open. Claire's fingers closed around the USB. The room remained focused on Ethan's performance. Nobody noticed. Nobody except Claire. She slid the drive into her pocket and resumed adjusting the towel. Ethan expected humiliation. The crowd expected embarrassment. Instead, Claire offered a polite smile. Enjoy your evening, Ethan. Then she turned and walked away. The laughter faded behind her as she guided the cart toward the service hallway. Her expression never changed. But once the ballroom doors closed behind her, the noise vanished. Only the distant hum of air conditioning remained. Claire stopped beneath a fluorescent light. Slowly, she slipped the USB from her pocket and examined it between her fingers. For months, she had been collecting fragments. Missing pieces, small inconsistencies hidden inside reports and conversations. Tonight, one more piece had fallen directly into her hands. Behind the ballroom wall, applause suddenly erupted. Ethan was probably soaking in the attention, probably convinced he had won another round. Claire looked down at the tiny drive resting in her palm. Then she placed it carefully inside her bag and continued down the hallway. The wheels of the cleaning cart echoed softly against the floor. For everyone else, the evening had just begun. For Claire Whitmore, the game had finally moved to the next stage. By the time Claire Whitmore unlocked the door to her apartment, the city skyline had dissolved into scattered lights beyond the rain-speckled window. The place was small. A one-bedroom unit above a corner pharmacy. No luxury furniture. No floor-to-ceiling windows. No signs of the life she once shared with Ethan Crawford. She set her bag on the kitchen table and stood silently for a moment. The apartment hummed with the soft sound of an aging refrigerator. Somewhere outside, a siren echoed through the night before fading into the distance. Then Claire reached into her bag and placed the black USB drive on the table. It sat there beneath the warm yellow light like a missing puzzle piece finally returning home. She did not rush to plug it in. Instead, she crossed the room and opened a narrow closet. Behind winter coats and storage boxes sat a gray filing cabinet secured with a small lock. She entered a code. The drawer slid open. Inside were dozens of neatly organized folders. Red tabs, blue tabs, dates written in black ink, company reports, public filings, printed emails, meeting schedules, photographs of documents taken from conference room screens after hours. Months of work. Months of patience. Claire removed one folder labeled Crawford and placed it beside the USB drive. A photograph slipped loose from the stack. She picked it up. The picture showed a younger version of herself standing beside Ethan outside a courthouse years ago. They were smiling, ambitious, certain the future belonged to them. Claire studied the image for only a second before turning it face down. Then she inserted the USB drive into her laptop. The screen glowed. A directory appeared. Her eyes narrowed. Financial spreadsheets. Internal communications. Draft contracts. She clicked through the folders one by one. The room remained silent except for the faint tapping of keys. 20 minutes later, she stopped scrolling. Her hand rested motionless on the mouse. There it was. The transfer authorization. A document she had suspected existed but had never been able to find. A chain of transactions connecting Bennett Global Holdings to 3 shell companies registered under unrelated names. On paper, everything looked legal, clean, ordinary. But Claire noticed something else. A timestamp. She opened another file. Then another. Slowly, the pattern emerged. Ethan had moved money between accounts just hours before quarterly reports were submitted to investors. Not enough to trigger alarms. Just enough to change the appearance of performance numbers. Claire leaned back in her chair. The rain outside intensified, tapping softly against the glass. Months earlier, she had noticed discrepancies while cleaning executive conference rooms after meetings. A figure left visible on a screen. A report forgotten on a table. An overheard conversation ending abruptly when she entered the room with her cart. Most people saw a cleaner and stopped paying attention. That had become Ethan's greatest mistake. Claire opened a notebook beside her laptop. Several pages were already filled with dates and arrows connecting names. She added another entry, then circled it in red ink. The web was larger than she first believed, which meant Ethan was becoming more confident, more careless. Across town, executives were probably still celebrating in the ballroom. Ethan was likely shaking hands and accepting congratulations. Believing his future was secure. Believing nobody could see what he was building behind closed doors. Claire closed the laptop halfway and looked at the growing stack of evidence spread across the table. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. Instead, she reached for her phone and opened a secure contact saved under a single initial. L. A message appeared almost immediately. Any updates? Claire glanced at the transfer authorization glowing on the screen. Her fingers moved across the keyboard. Yes. He finally made his first major mistake. She sent the message. Seconds later came the reply. Then we wait. Claire looked toward the dark window where her reflection stared back at her. Calm. Focused. Ready. She typed 3 words. Not for long. Then she closed the phone, reopened the folder, and continued working while the city slept around her. 3 days later, Bennett Global Holdings moved exactly the way Claire expected. The higher Ethan Crawford climbed, the less carefully he watched his footing. Monday morning sunlight spilled through the glass walls of the executive floor, while Claire pushed her cleaning cart past a conference room lined with framed awards and photographs. Inside, a strategy meeting had just ended. Executives gathered their tablets and coffee cups while discussing projections for the next quarter. Claire entered after they left. She moved quietly between leather chairs, collecting empty water bottles and straightening notepads. On the giant presentation screen, a financial chart remained frozen. Someone had forgotten to disconnect the system. Claire glanced up while wiping fingerprints from the conference table. A single number caught her attention. It matched a figure she had seen on the USB drive. Not close. Exact. She continued cleaning without hesitation. A minute later, she pulled a folded receipt from her apron pocket and casually wrote down the number before dropping the paper into her cart. Then she returned to work. By lunchtime, the receipt sat inside another folder in her apartment. Another piece added to the growing puzzle. Meanwhile, Ethan was becoming the center of attention everywhere he went. The upcoming succession announcement had transformed him into a celebrity within the company. Employees stepped aside when he walked through the lobby. Department heads laughed a little harder at his jokes. Investors requested private lunches. Every compliment fed his confidence. Every compliment made him louder. Claire noticed it immediately. The man who once double-checked every detail now preferred audiences. At a leadership luncheon later that week, she watched from across the ballroom as Ethan entertained a table of regional directors. The room buzzed with conversation and the clinking of silverware. Ethan stood beside the stage with one hand resting on a chair. "The future belongs to people willing to take risks," he said. Several executives nodded. Someone applauded. Ethan smiled. He enjoyed applause. Claire had learned that years ago. She remembered evenings when he would rehearse presentations in front of a mirror, adjusting every word until it sounded impressive. Back then, she had admired his ambition. Now she understood something else. Ambition and ego often arrive together. An ego always demanded an audience. That evening, Claire returned to her apartment and opened a video call with the contact saved under the initial L. Leonard Graves appeared on the screen. A corporate attorney with silver hair and reading glasses balanced near the edge of his nose. He reviewed documents while Claire organized files across the table. "He is talking more," Leonard observed after reading several meeting summaries. Claire slid another folder toward the camera. "That is exactly what I need." Leonard adjusted his glasses. Most people try to stop someone like Ethan immediately. Claire highlighted a date on one of the documents. Stopping him now would only close the door. Leonard studied her expression for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. He understood. Every new speech Ethan delivered, every presentation, every investor discussion, each one created a public record. Each one increased the distance between his statements and the reality hidden in the numbers. Claire was not building a case around suspicion anymore. She was documenting contradictions. By Friday evening, another opportunity arrived. Ethan appeared on a regional business podcast streamed to investors and shareholders. Claire listened from her kitchen table while highlighting reports. Ethan spoke confidently about transparency, accountability, and responsible leadership. His voice filled the room. Claire compared each statement against the documents spread before her. Yellow highlights multiplied across the pages. 1 hour later, she placed the marker down and looked at the evidence surrounding her. Ethan believed he was strengthening his reputation. In reality, he was constructing the walls of a trap one sentence at a time. And the higher those walls rose, the harder his fall would be when the doors finally closed. Most people assumed Claire Whitmore spent her evenings exactly the way they imagined a cleaner would. They pictured television noise drifting through a modest apartment, a frozen dinner in a microwave, and another ordinary night before another ordinary shift. The truth looked very different. On a cool Thursday evening, long after the executive floor lights went dark, Claire sat at a corner table inside a quiet coffee shop nearly 15 miles from company headquarters. The place smelled of roasted beans and fresh pastries. Rain tapped softly against the front windows. A half-finished cup of black coffee rested beside an open notebook covered in dates, arrows, and names. Across from her sat a man in his early 60s wearing a worn brown jacket. His name was Daniel Mercer. 5 years earlier, he had owned a small logistics company that partnered with Bennett Global Holdings. Today, he was retired. Claire slid a document across the table. Daniel adjusted his glasses and studied the page. His expression changed immediately. "I have seen this company name before," he said quietly. Claire uncapped a pen. "Where?" Daniel pointed to a line near the bottom. "During a vendor review. They appeared suddenly and received contracts nobody else could explain." Claire made a note. Another connection. Another thread. Another piece of the network growing beneath the surface. Over the following weeks, her evenings followed a similar rhythm. Coffee shops, small diners, quiet library meeting rooms, conversations with former vendors, overlooked shareholders, and retired department managers. People Ethan had dismissed years ago. People who no longer had a reason to stay silent. Claire rarely spoke much during those meetings. Instead, she listened. A folded legal pad remained open in front of her while others filled the silence with memories. Names resurfaced. Transactions resurfaced. Decisions resurfaced. Patterns began to emerge. Every road eventually circled back toward the same group of shell companies hidden inside Ethan's growing empire. One Saturday morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of her apartment while folders covered nearly every inch of the dining table. Blue tabs, yellow tabs, red tabs. The evidence no longer looked like scattered fragments. It looked like a map. Claire stood over the table holding a marker. She connected one company to another with a straight red line. Then another. Then another. When she finally stepped back, a complete structure stretched across the documents. For the first time, she could see the entire design. Ethan had not simply moved money. He had created a system, careful, layered, hidden behind respectable paperwork and impressive presentations. Her phone vibrated. A new message appeared from Leonard Graves. Board succession vote moved forward. Early next month. Claire read the message twice. The timeline had accelerated. She looked toward the evidence wall. The game was moving faster now. Later that afternoon, she returned to Bennett Global Holdings for her weekend shift. Employees hurried through the lobby carrying laptops and presentation folders. Excitement surrounded the upcoming leadership transition. Near the elevator bank, a large digital display featured a photograph of Richard Bennett speaking at a shareholder event. Beneath it ran a headline celebrating the company's future growth. Claire pushed her cleaning cart past the screen. As the elevator doors opened, she noticed Ethan standing inside with two board members. Their laughter echoed into the lobby. One of the directors clapped Ethan on the shoulder. "Looks like congratulations are in order soon." Ethan smiled confidently. The elevator doors closed. Claire watched the numbers climb toward the executive floors. Then she lowered her eyes and continued walking. Inside her cart sat a plain manila folder containing enough information to change the future of the company. Nobody noticed it. Nobody noticed her. And that was exactly why she was still winning. The announcement arrived on a Tuesday morning. Employees crowded around lobby screens, checked company emails, and whispered in elevator corners as the message spread through the building. Richard Bennett had officially scheduled the shareholder assembly that would determine the next chapter of Bennett Global Holdings. The meeting was set for 3 weeks away. For most people inside the company, it felt like a formality. Ethan Crawford's future seemed already written. Claire Whitmore watched the reactions from behind her cleaning cart. Near the reception desk, 2 managers stood beside a coffee station discussing the news. One of them smiled. "It is over. Ethan has this locked up." The other nodded. "Nobody else even comes close." Claire continued wiping a glass partition without looking toward them. The cloth moved slowly across the surface. One smooth stroke after another. Outside the window, morning traffic crawled through downtown streets. Inside, the building buzzed with anticipation. By lunchtime, the executive floor felt different. More visitors, more meetings, more closed doors. Every conference room seemed occupied. Investors flew in. Consultants arrived carrying presentation binders. Public relations teams rehearsed statements. The company was preparing for a transition. Claire noticed something else. Ethan's schedule had become unusually crowded. Names she had never seen before appeared on visitor logs. New legal firms, financial advisors, outside contractors. The pattern bothered her. That evening she sat at her apartment table studying the latest records collected over the past month. The evidence wall stretched nearly the length of the room now. Colored notes connected transactions, companies, and individuals. Her eyes stopped on one date, then another, then a third. Slowly she reached for a calculator. The numbers aligned perfectly. Too perfectly. Claire leaned back in her chair. A cold realization settled over the room. Ethan was not simply preparing for promotion. He was preparing for protection. She opened several documents side by side. Transfer records, corporate restructuring plans, draft board resolutions. The pieces clicked together. If the shareholder assembly approved Ethan's leadership package, several questionable transactions would become buried beneath a newly authorized corporate framework. What currently looked suspicious could soon appear legitimate. The window was closing. Her phone buzzed. Leonard Graves was calling. Claire answered immediately. "You found something?" Leonard said before she spoke a word. Claire looked at the documents spread before her. "He is moving faster than we expected." Silence lingered briefly. Then Leonard asked, "Can we stop it?" Claire stood and walked toward the evidence wall. Her eyes moved across dozens of pages. Months of work. Hundreds of details. Thousands of decisions. She stopped in front of a red line connecting Ethan to one of the shell companies. "Yes," she said quietly, "but not the way he expects." The next week unfolded like a countdown clock. Ethan appeared constantly in company communications. Photographs, interviews, leadership panels, investor meetings. Every public appearance strengthened his image. Every public appearance also strengthened Claire's strategy. The more Ethan spoke about accountability and transparency, the more vulnerable he became to contradiction. One afternoon Claire passed an executive conference room and noticed Ethan through the glass wall. He stood beside a screen displaying future growth projections. Board members listened carefully. Ethan looked confident, relaxed, certain. Claire paused only long enough to see him point toward a chart before continuing down the hallway. Inside her cart rested a sealed manila envelope. Not evidence, not accusations, something far more useful. A carefully selected document designed to reach exactly one person at exactly the right time. Claire had spent months collecting proof. Now the game was changing. The investigation was over. The strategy was beginning. The following Monday began like every other workday inside Bennett Global Holdings. Employees hurried through revolving doors carrying coffee cups and laptops. Elevators chimed. Phones rang. Computer screens glowed across dozens of departments. Everything appeared normal. Claire Whitmore intended to keep it that way. She arrived before sunrise and parked her cleaning cart beside a supply closet on the executive floor. The sealed manila envelope remained tucked beneath a stack of maintenance forms. Nobody paid attention to it. Nobody paid attention to her. At 9:15 that morning, a junior administrative assistant entered a conference room to prepare for an executive meeting. A single document sat waiting on the polished table. No cover letter. No explanation. Just a photocopy of a transfer authorization linked to one of Ethan Crawford's shell companies. The assistant frowned briefly before placing the paper with the meeting materials. 30 minutes later, Ethan entered the room with several senior managers. Claire never stepped inside. She never needed to. By noon, something had changed. The shift was subtle at first. Two department heads emerged from a meeting speaking in lower voices than usual. An investor relations director crossed the lobby with a tense expression. A legal consultant arrived unexpectedly carrying a briefcase. Claire noticed every detail while wiping fingerprints from elevator panels. The envelope had landed exactly where she intended. Not enough evidence to accuse anyone. Not enough evidence to trigger an investigation. Just enough to create a question. And questions were dangerous, especially to people with secrets. The real change came 2 days later. Claire entered an executive conference room after hours and immediately noticed something missing. A presentation folder normally left on a side table was gone. Filing cabinets stood slightly open. A shredder bin overflowed with paper strips. She paused beside the machine. Thin pieces of discarded documents filled the container. Someone was cleaning up. Claire continued collecting trash without reacting. But later that evening, she sat at her apartment table sorting through notes while a small smile appeared for the first time in weeks. Ethan had taken the bait. Across town, Ethan's world was becoming less comfortable. Every question raised new concerns. Every concern created pressure. Instead of ignoring the issue, he started moving faster. New meetings appeared on his calendar. New legal reviews were requested. Additional financial records were altered, reorganized, and relocated. To Ethan, these actions felt protective. To Claire, they were gifts. Each change created fresh timestamps, fresh records, fresh evidence. On Thursday night, Leonard Graves joined a video call from his office. City lights glowed behind him through a wall of glass. Claire placed several new documents in front of her camera. Leonard studied them carefully. His eyebrows rose. "These were created this week?" Claire nodded. Claire highlighted a sequence of digital approval records. "And every revision leaves footprints." Leonard looked at her for several seconds before shaking his head. Most people would have rushed to expose him months ago. Claire closed one folder and opened another. "Then we would only have assumptions." She tapped the newest records. "Now we have behavior." Outside her apartment, rain streaked across the window. Inside, the evidence continued to grow. Ethan believed he was protecting his future. He believed he was closing vulnerabilities before the shareholder assembly. He never realized that every attempt to erase a trail created a larger one. By the end of the week, Claire stood before her evidence wall once more. New red lines stretched across the documents. New dates filled the timeline. The original scheme was no longer the strongest part of the case. The cover-up was. And somewhere inside the executive offices of Bennett Global Holdings, Ethan Crawford was working late into the night, unknowingly building the final pieces of the trap that would soon close around him. The morning of the shareholder assembly arrived beneath a clear blue sky. Downtown streets filled early with black sedans, rideshare vehicles, and executives carrying leather portfolios toward the headquarters of Bennett Global Holdings. Inside the building, security checkpoints moved steadily as investors, board members, and senior leadership teams gathered for the most important meeting in the company's recent history. The atmosphere felt polished on the surface. Beneath it, tension lingered everywhere. Claire Whitmore arrived before most of the guests. Her cleaning cart rolled quietly across the marble lobby floor, while workers adjusted seating arrangements and tested presentation screens. Nobody paid special attention to her presence. They never did. By 8 o'clock, the assembly hall had transformed into a showcase of corporate success. Rows of chairs faced a large stage framed by digital displays. Company achievements rotated across giant screens. Revenue milestones, expansion projects, awards. Every image reinforced the same message: stability, growth, leadership. Claire stood near the back of the room replacing a trash liner when she noticed Ethan Crawford entering through a side corridor. Several board members immediately approached him. Handshakes followed. Smiles followed. One investor even laughed loudly at something Ethan said. Confidence seemed to surround him like a tailored suit. From a distance, he looked exactly like the future chief executive officer everyone expected to see. Claire watched for only a moment before returning to work. A few minutes later, she entered an empty service hallway and opened a small storage locker. Inside sat a slim black portfolio. She lifted it carefully. Months of evidence rested inside. Organized, indexed, cross-referenced, ready. She closed the locker and carried the portfolio toward a private conference room on the 3rd floor. Leonard Graves was already waiting. Papers covered the table. A projector glowed softly against one wall. Leonard glanced toward the portfolio and nodded once. Neither of them needed a long conversation anymore. Everything had already been prepared. "Board members have received the supplemental review packet," Leonard said. Claire placed the portfolio on the table. "And Ethan?" Leonard adjusted his glasses. "He believes the questions are routine." Claire looked through the conference room window toward the city skyline. Sunlight reflected off neighboring skyscrapers. Good. 30 minutes later, the assembly officially began. Shareholders filled their seats. Cameras activated. Reporters occupied a designated media section near the rear of the hall. Richard Bennett walked onto the stage to applause. The founder looked older than he had in previous years, but his posture remained steady. He thanked investors, reviewed company performance, and discussed future opportunities. The presentation unfolded exactly as expected. Then came the leadership portion of the agenda. Ethan approached the podium beneath bright stage lights. Applause echoed throughout the room. Claire stood near the back beside a service entrance. Ethan adjusted his microphone and began speaking about vision, accountability, and the future of Bennett Global Holdings. His voice carried easily across the hall. Several shareholders nodded along. Some took notes. Others simply listened. Ethan looked completely at ease. Every gesture appeared rehearsed. Every answer appeared polished. Yet Claire noticed something different. Each time a board member raised a question about financial oversight, Ethan's smile lingered half a second longer before he responded. Each time governance procedures appeared on screen, his fingers tightened slightly around the podium edge. Tiny cracks, almost invisible, but they were there. The trap was no longer waiting somewhere in the future. It was here now. The room simply had not realized it yet. Claire lowered her eyes briefly toward the black portfolio resting beside her chair. Everything she needed was already inside. Across the hall, Ethan continued speaking with the confidence of a man certain he had won. And for the first time since this game began, Claire knew exactly how the final move would unfold. The assembly hall remained silent as Ethan Crawford finished another answer. He stood beneath the stage lights with the ease of someone who had spent years preparing for this exact moment. Investors listened attentively. Board members reviewed notes. Reporters typed quietly from the media section. Everything appeared under control. Then a board member seated near the front adjusted his microphone. "Before we proceed to the next agenda item," he said, "there are several questions regarding vendor restructuring activities conducted during the past 18 months. Ethan smiled politely. "Of course." The board member glanced toward a packet resting on the table. "Can you explain the purpose of Horizon Strategic Consulting?" Ethan's expression barely changed. "A standard advisory partner," he answered without hesitation. "They provided operational guidance during expansion efforts." Several heads nodded. It sounded reasonable. Across the room, Claire Whitmore remained near the rear aisle beside the black portfolio. Her attention never left the stage. Another board member leaned forward. "And your relationship to the company?" Ethan folded his hands. "None beyond professional engagement." A screen behind him illuminated. A document appeared. Incorporation records, ownership structures, transaction summaries. Ethan looked briefly toward the display before returning his attention to the board. "As I said, a routine vendor relationship." More documents appeared. Additional companies. Additional transactions. The room remained calm, but the atmosphere had shifted. Investors stopped taking notes and began reading more carefully. A reporter lowered his coffee cup. Someone in the second row adjusted their glasses. Ethan continued answering, confident, controlled. Yet every response seemed to create another question. A board member pointed to a date highlighted on the screen. "Then perhaps you can clarify why several funds moved between these entities immediately before quarterly reporting deadlines." Ethan stepped closer to the podium. That timing was coincidental. Another document appeared. Then another. Transfer records. Approval records. Revision histories. None of them accused him directly. None contained dramatic revelations. Instead, they formed something more dangerous. A timeline. Ethan cleared his throat. Those adjustments were reviewed internally. "Reviewed by whom?" asked another director. Ethan answered immediately. "The compliance team." The director looked down at his packet. "Interesting." He turned a page. "Because these records indicate the compliance review occurred 2 weeks after the transfers." A murmur moved through the room. Ethan's smile tightened slightly. For the first time all morning, he paused before responding. Claire noticed it. Leonard noticed it. The board noticed it. The pause lasted less than 2 seconds. But it was there. More questions followed. Not accusations. Questions. Precise. Methodical. Every answer Ethan provided seemed to collide with a document already waiting on the screen. He explained a transaction. A timestamp contradicted it. He explained an approval. An internal memo complicated it. He explained a restructuring effort. A revised filing suggested something different. The pressure did not come from a single piece of evidence. It came from the growing pattern. Ethan shifted his stance. His hand moved to the podium edge. A faint line appeared between his brows. Around the hall, shareholders exchanged looks. Investors whispered quietly. Reporters typed faster. Then came the question Claire had been waiting for. A senior director lifted a document from the packet. Mr. Crawford, can you explain why these records show modifications made after concerns were raised regarding these transactions? Ethan looked down. The room watched. Every eye, every camera, every board member. His answer arrived quickly. Too quickly. He began describing corrective actions, document revisions, and procedural updates intended to address potential misunderstandings. Halfway through the explanation, the realization spread across the room. Nobody needed to accuse him anymore. By attempting to defend the revisions, Ethan had confirmed they existed. By explaining the changes, he had acknowledged the timeline. By justifying the corrections, he had connected himself directly to them. Silence settled over the assembly hall. The trap had never depended on exposing a secret. It depended on allowing Ethan Crawford to explain it himself. And at that moment, standing beneath the bright stage lights he once believed would celebrate his victory, he unknowingly completed the final piece. For several long seconds after Ethan Crawford finished speaking, nobody in the assembly hall moved. The giant screens still displayed the final timeline of transactions and revisions. The documents remained frozen beneath the bright stage lights. Investors sat motionless. Reporters stared at their notes. Board members exchanged measured looks across the front rows. The silence felt heavier than any argument could have been. Ethan remained at the podium, but the certainty that had carried him through the morning was gone. Richard Bennett finally rose from his seat near the center of the stage. The founder walked slowly toward the microphone. His expression revealed nothing. No anger, no celebration, no satisfaction, just quiet focus. The room watched him carefully. Richard looked toward the board members, then toward the shareholders. In light of the information reviewed today, he said calmly, the board will postpone all succession decisions pending a full internal review. Pens immediately began moving across notepads. Reporters typed furiously. Camera lenses shifted toward the stage. Ethan opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came. Richard simply nodded once and stepped away from the microphone. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Groups formed throughout the hall. Conversations erupted in low voices. Investors compared notes. Directors gathered around legal counsel. Employees whispered in clusters near the exits. Claire Whitmore remained where she was for a moment longer. Then she picked up the black portfolio and walked toward the service corridor. No announcement followed her. No spotlight found her. Most people still had no idea who had assembled the evidence that changed the course of the day. 3 weeks later, the internal review concluded. The findings confirmed concerns regarding financial disclosures, document revisions, and governance procedures. Several leadership positions were re-examined. Multiple oversight reforms were recommended. The company entered a period of restructuring unlike anything it had experienced in years. During those same weeks, Claire continued arriving before sunrise. She continued pushing her cleaning cart through hallways she knew by heart. She continued collecting forgotten coffee cups and straightening conference rooms after meetings. On the surface, nothing about her routine appeared different. Yet people had started noticing something they never noticed before. They listened when she spoke. They greeted her by name. They looked directly at her instead of through her. One quiet Friday afternoon, Claire received a message asking her to report to the executive boardroom. She arrived carrying a notepad and expecting another interview related to the review process. Instead, she found Richard Bennett seated alone near the windows overlooking the city. A thick folder rested on the polished table. Sunlight reflected off the glass towers outside. Richard slid the folder toward her. Claire opened it. Inside were hundreds of pages documenting the investigation, her supporting research, and recommendations submitted during the review. Every late night, every note, every connection she uncovered, every decision she made. Richard folded his hands. "Most people spend their careers looking down from the top floor," he said quietly. "You learned this company from every floor." Claire looked at the folder. Richard continued. "You saw what others ignored." He pushed a second document across the table. This one was shorter. A formal board resolution. Effective immediately, Claire Whitmore would join the executive leadership team overseeing the company's transition and future operations. She read the page once, then again. The city shimmered beyond the windows. Down below, traffic moved through familiar streets. Richard stood and extended his hand. Claire accepted it. Not because she needed validation, not because someone had rescued her. The victory had been earned long before this moment. Weeks later, Claire crossed the lobby where people once laughed while she pushed a cleaning cart across polished marble floors. The building looked exactly the same. The difference was that everyone finally saw what had been there all along. She did not win by becoming louder. She did not win by humiliating anyone in return. She won because she understood the game before anyone realized she was playing it. And as the elevator doors closed behind her, the future of Bennett Global Holdings moved upward with her.